Hello, my friends. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up. I'm so very happy to have you pressing play on the show. You're going to love both of my conversations with both of my guests today, as you did hopefully yesterday. A lot of great feedback on yesterday's show. If you haven't heard my very special conversation with Dave Rothkopf and Dr. Arthur Kaplan, then go back and definitely listen to that one. Today, I've got the author of a book called Gunfight: My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. He's a former executive at the Kimber gun manufacturer, former firearms executive, and he wrote a book about the business. And I thought having him on, along with anti-racist Tim Wise, would give us two really good looks and insights into the white supremacist terrorists who shot black people at a grocery store in Western New York, in Buffalo, New York, over the weekend, which has been something that has really affected, obviously, black folks, most importantly, striking fear into black communities across the country. So many of my friends, so many listeners that I've been talking to, it's been absolutely horrible. And so trying to understand both the component of hate and fear and racism, as well as gun violence, I thought that was two of the best angles we could take. I did also, I'll have you know, reach out to the former nominee for mayor for Buffalo, India Walton, thanks to Tina Winsett, who gave me a heads up about her as a great idea for a guest. She's been talking about it, and I'm hoping to get her on at some point this week, but she just hasn't been able to make it. So hopefully we'll get India on, but that'll be a good third angle. But that's what I want to try to do more of when I can. When something like this happens, try to understand it from a couple of different experts' angles. So Ryan Bussey, the author of Gunfight and anti-racist Tim Wise, that is who's on today's show. And no news today because, again, I am busy with the campaign. The last day is today. The election is today. The last day of campaigning, really, I guess, yesterday in terms of affecting my life. It's over. And tomorrow I'll talk all about it and the experience and what it meant and what I learned. And hopefully the outcome will be a positive one, and we'll get the anti-racist candidates on who are also amazing advocates for public education in general and all the important things about public education. So John Maltby and Brian Montez are their names, and I hope that they win today. And I will talk to you about it on tomorrow's podcast, and maybe I'll even get them on. We'll see if it's appropriate. But it's been a really interesting and important experience. I've made a whole bunch of new friends now, many of which are listening to the show and even subscribing with a paid subscription. So I'm very excited about that. And we'll see. So that's why I don't have the news again today, but I do have these great guests. Both perspectives I think are really valuable. Tim Wise, amazing as always. But first, we're going to get to Ryan Bussey. He is a former firearms executive who was nominated multiple times for the prestigious Shooting Industry Person of the Year award. He served in many leadership roles, including as an advisor for the United States Senate Sportsman's Caucus and the Biden presidential campaign. And his book is really, really great because it's basically an insider's call out of a wild, secretive, and critically important industry. It shows us how America's gun industry shifted from prioritizing safety and ethics to one that is addicted to fear, conspiracy, intolerance, and secrecy. And it recounts Ryan's personal transformation. It's just amazing. It's such a good book. Ryan's such a great guy. He's also a longtime listener of the old show on Sirius XM and now the podcast. I was really excited to get him back on. He is on Twitter at Ryan D. Bussey, and you can click on that link, watch his TED Talk. Go to ryanbusseyauthor.com and, of course, get the book, Gunfight: My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. So good. And I think you're going to really like this conversation with a very thoughtful, smart, passionate guy. Here we go. All right, there he is. Ryan Bussey joins me. And I said, thanks for reaching out to me. And you said, yeah, I wish it were under different circumstances. But unfortunately, this is about the horrible shooting in Buffalo. And you can talk about many others as well. Thanks for joining me. Great to have you back, even under these circumstances.
Yeah, it's not funny, but it's 2 times now I've been doing speaking engagements where the speaking engagement was already scheduled. And then I ended up speaking about a mass shooting that happened between scheduling. That happened to me this weekend. It happened to me several months ago. I did a CNN segment, and the Oxford shooting in Michigan happened as I was on the plane to go to do the CNN segment. And the fact that that's happened to me twice in the last, several months tells us we might have an effing problem here,
Yeah, well, you knew that we did 20 years ago, as well as I've just reread. You told me to reread the chapter Couch Commando in your awesome book, which if people haven't gotten yet, it just illuminates so many important things. And it's such a really important book that you wrote called Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. Couch Commando is apparently basically what you would classify the Buffalo shooter, whose name we don't say here on this show as, yes?
Yeah, there in my book, I note that there are several pejorative terms that the industry executives came to use for various classes of firearms customer. And Couch Commando is one of them. And there's a really illustrative quote in there from one of the co-founders of Black Rifle Coffee, Matt Best, who basically, says there's guys who couldn't serve for whatever reason, but they want to run down the range with their AR-15, do a fucking transition drill, and they want a little taste of the drug, In other words, we're creating and marketing to these people who, quote unquote, want a taste of the drug, whatever that drug is. And that's why it's not shocking to me to see 18-year-old kids decked out with tactical gear getting their taste of this drug.
Yeah, for sure. Back at the beginning of this book, or the beginning of this chapter, you talk about how you had come back from the NRA convention and saw, Wayne LaPierre spoke there, and you get intimate about your marriage with your amazing wife, Sarah, and how you basically compare yourself. You came home and she saw his speech and it was reprehensible, and she kind of confronted you about it, and you're like, I'm tired. Can we talk about this tomorrow? Which I thought was hilarious, because I've done that a billion times to get out of a tough conversation. But you basically compared yourself in that moment to an analogy, how you tried to avoid it with your wife, the same way that Republican congressmen try to avoid it with basically everybody. Why?
Yeah, I well, it was sneaking up on me as I was in the industry, right? And I think the sort of crazy thing about the firearms industry is that it got to a point where new markets had to be created, right? And I think LaPierre and the NRA tapped into at that, and that was not long after 9/11. But when gun sales dipped, then the NRA and political vitriol dipped, then the NRA just sort of instinctually knew that it had to tap into something to drive people to be more ginned up, more angry, buy more guns, do more crazy things. And after 9/11, it was obviously marginalize and increase the rage in and around Muslim Americans, and that's what Sarah was reacting to in that quote. And when you're in that pot of water and it's boiling slowly, like I was, I just kind of want to be done with it.
Yeah. And
I think a lot of Republicans over the last 5 or 6 years maybe started off kind of in that pot of water, like, we need to gin up voters, we need more rage, it gets people to the polls, and then pretty soon you wake up and you have Trumpism. And I think I basically draw the parallels in the book that the way the firearms industry and the NRA did that and the way Trump and Trumpism did that are exactly the same thing.
Yeah, you do so well. You write that Wayne LaPierre thanked his members for laying off most of the 35 employees of the Million Mom March, the group responsible for organizing a Mother's Day march in 2000 in response to mass shootings and other gun-related deaths. And I guess one part of that stuck with me is that there was a Million Mom March in 2000 because of mass shootings. It's 2022. And I just felt like reading your book, and if you look at dates of these types of shootings, the worst of which is where people are targeted for, their religion, their ethnicity, the color of their skin, all the way back to 2000, Ryan. It really gives you a good perspective, or a terrible perspective, on how terrible things still are.
Well, and I hate to tell you, but just like with our politics, I fear that the marketing and frankly, that 2000 timeframe, that was before sort of the incendiary marketing campaigns and just sort of aggressiveness that we see. That was before tactical gear was really marketed to any civilian. That was before AR-15s or any kind of, even a tactical glove could be displayed at firearms industry trade shows. There was still this understood decency.
Oh, I did not. Tell me more about that. There was a time where at gun shows, there was a line that they wouldn't cross to sell what you're calling tactical gear, which I think some of us probably know just by context, but body armor. And you said gloves. I didn't even there was a line.
Yeah. So up until, and it wasn't really that long ago, up until about 2006 or 2007, which is 15 years ago now, you couldn't, the NSSF, which owns one of the largest trade shows in the world, it's the firearms industry trade show, SHOT Show, and that's the National Shooting Sports Foundation, would not allow any tactical gear to be displayed in the big booths of firearms industry companies. So not tactical gloves, not tactical vests, not helmets, not AR-15s. Like, you couldn't display this stuff. Now if you walk through SHOT Show today, dude, it's like a war zone. There's shoot 'em up games. It's crazy town.
I'm sure they have helmets with cameras mounted on them. You saw.
There's absolutely nothing. There's remote controlled 50 caliber tanks that you can buy. There is literally, your imagination cannot even begin to approach.
Let me just ask maybe a dumb question, but what wrong message did tactical gear send at a gun show?
Well, I think that it was never really enumerated, much like many of the norms in our society that we've broken over the last 7 or 8 years are never really enumerated. But I describe in the book kind of this group of industry wise men that instinctually knew that spreading sort of the gear of war amongst the general public was just not a good idea. Nobody ever sat down and listed like, well, if we sell helmets, it's going to do this. And if we sell bulletproof vests, it's going to do this. And if we push and advertise AR-15s, it's going to do this. Nobody ever thought that, but they knew that, they walked through the same grocery stores that you and I walk through. They walked through the same airports that you and I walk through. They lived with the same Americans that we live with now. And they looked around and said, maybe it's not a good idea to just proliferate the gear of war throughout society, what that might do to the sort of mentality, especially, let's face it, of generally white young men. I mean, that's what we continually face. That's what we've faced in Buffalo. Just wasn't a good idea. Now, Pete, you go from that to now we have marketing campaigns, overt marketing campaigns with big flashy websites for guns like the Urban Super Sniper. The Urban Super Sniper. We have marketing campaigns for the Ultimate Arms Warmonger. That's another rifle. I mean, what you sell a 19-year-old kid, an Urban Super Sniper. What do you think what's the message? What's he supposed to do?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say something that I just feel that in light of this shooting and similar shootings and the rhetoric and the temperature in our country right now, I just feel like at this point, the gun industry has become the pro-Civil War industry. Ramp up for a war with your neighbor, you're going to need all this shit. So you can, start with guns and tactical gear and get to food buckets. But I mean, basically, the story has always been for the gun industry, how do we make more and more money? It's true of any for-profit company, right? You sell ice cream, whatever. But in this case, it's deadly weapons. And so, as you write, and so well in this book, you talk about the rhetoric, you talk about the campaigns, the marketing campaigns, everything you witnessed and at times were even involved with. But now, it just seems that what you're saying to me now is that these gun shows, this industry, it sell everything you can, make people believe they're in a war with their neighbors.
Yeah, I referenced some famous or infamous Dana Loesch NRA ad.
Yeah.
The clenched fist of truth ad, which is basically to that point, right? As sales dipped in 2017, 2018, 2019, Dana Loesch, the NRA, they pay for NRA TV. It's a $37 million budget to launch that, as an online streaming platform. And she launched that famous ad. I call it the hate your neighbor ad, to your point. And it's basically, when you run out of things to hate, well, hate your neighbor, buy guns to have a civil war with your neighbor. Now we're in a position where, I say in the book, the gun business is kind of like the booze business. It's pretty good when times are bad, it's pretty good when times are good, and it's fucking great when times are bad. Now there's this sort of the industry benefits from creating whatever weather it wants. It doesn't matter how wet it gets; it sells the umbrellas. It just can't slow down. So the more racial tension we have, think about this in simple, really like ugly but true terms. If you're now a black guy in Buffalo and you're worried about copycats, are you more likely to go out and buy a gun now to protect yourself? Probably.
Well, I would only add that, as far as I can tell on Twitter and talking to friends, if you're a black guy in America right now, because the copycats don't have to be in Buffalo, they can be, as what was the El Paso shooter? Like there was another case where he traveled from a white area, if I recall, to find brown people. That's what this guy did. This guy grew up near where I grew up, which is a really white area, and he had to go to Buffalo. So, I mean, I don't think it's, I'm just saying, I think it's
everywhere. No, I'm just using that. But sure. the point is that the worse this gets, the more guns are sold. I mean, and do we want, it's not that it's not legal. I mean, this guy purchased the gun legally from all indications. That's the point is this the country we want to live in? And we're marketing to this.
One of the things that I think is so important that you mention in the book, in this chapter, actually, Couch Commando, again, is you talk about this law that President Bush signed into law in 2005, October 2005. It was called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. You write, this controversial bill shielded firearms companies from liability claims arising from the unlawful use of their guns, meaning that cities no longer had standing to sue for the impacts of gun violence in their limits, and that the victims of mass shootings were barred from suing manufacturers or dealers. The new law had massive ramifications that were now lost on the NRA. In a press conference, Wayne LaPierre accurately described the law as, quote, the most significant piece of pro-gun legislation in 20 years. I feel like I didn't know that until I read your book. People talk a lot about how gun manufacturers, gun sellers, whoever, should be responsible for what happens with their guns. But Ryan, people talk about that with pools and medicine and bar owners. And, there's all kinds of different legal action you can take in this very litigious country if someone else might be responsible for it. But the gun industry, not for them. And it's crazy because so many people kill themselves or other people with their guns, right?
So let me explain this a bit. As I've told you, Pete, like I've loved your show for I don't know how long because it's smart. And so I think I often hear progressives state the sort of particulars around PLACA. It's this law, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, wrong. First off, the firearms industry can be sued for, like if you're a firearms company and you make a gun that's defective and blows up in somebody's hand, like it's physically defective, you can be sued for that. So it's not that gun companies can't be sued for anything, but go back to your swimming pool example. If a swimming pool company makes this above ground swimming pool and they advertise some egregiously like throw all your kids in it and feed them all vodka and nobody will drown pool. I don't know, some crazy egregious, if
the marketing campaign around the pool is telling you can do anything you want and be irresponsible. You can do
anything. If this law were applied to swimming pools, they could not be sued for that, even if like all your kids drowned in there, right? Because the law would basically say, well, Pete was an idiot and he let his kids drink vodka and jump in the pool. That's what the law says. So in all the rest of our society, if you have a company that makes something and you advertise it in sort of this aggressively egregious way, and then somebody follows your advertising, you can be sued for that. Firearms companies cannot be sued for that. They can be sued for defective products, just like any other company, but they can't be sued for this aggressive marketing because the law says if Pete buys the gun and then he goes and does something illegal, which by definition, most of the crime that you commit with a gun is illegal, then you can't be sued. So if I sell you an urban super sniper and then you go out in an urban environment and snipe people with it, the company cannot be sued, even though the marketing encouraged you to do that.
Right. So well said. Thank you for splitting that hair. My dad was an insurance agent. Bear with me here, Ryan. And he always talked to me about how he would never insure. I think as a school or like maybe a church or like a facility that had kids at it, if they had a trampoline. Yeah. Because they were so dangerous, he didn't want to. He's going to have to pay out that policy every time. I think that's an interesting analogy to jump from the next part of that chapter where you say, after, what is it, PLACA?
Yeah, PLACA.
Was passed, protecting arms dealers and gun manufacturers, Wall Street took notice because now investors felt, well, this is now a safe investment. Talk to me about how that changed the game further.
Yeah. Remember, we live now with cigarette and tobacco marketing laws, and the laws that eventually produced PLACA arose after the threat to the firearms company that were patterned on the cigarette settlement. So across the country, all the municipalities and states got together and basically sued Big Tobacco, right? They basically threatened them into oblivion. And then we had this settlement, and Big Tobacco said, we won't market this way. We can't sell to kids. We have these warnings on labels. And so municipalities all across the country saw that happen with Big Tobacco, and they said, wait, we're doing the same thing to gun companies. So for about 8 or 9 years, the same sort of threats were levied against firearms companies. Then Bush in 2005, at the behest of the NRA, says, no, we're going to stop that. And that's where PLACA came in. So PLACA basically blocked a cigarette type settlement against firearms companies. And so up until that point, the firearms industry was really quite small because there was a lot. It kept everybody really responsible. If you were worried about getting sued, you didn't market the Urban Super Sniper, right? You didn't market. There are now 500 companies that make AR-15s. There was like 1 or 2 then. There are now, I don't know, at least 500 companies that make body armor and everything else. There were none then. And so up until that point, there was just none of this sort of proliferation, and the firearms industry was pretty small. In that time, Smith & Wesson, the iconic company, sold for $15 million. $15 million. After all this happened, after PLACA, after this sort of everybody, the law ensured that the companies wouldn't be sued out of existence, big institutional investors came in. These publicly traded gun companies, Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Alliant Tech Systems, they got woven into 401ks, into retirement programs, everything else. And an illustrative point is that Smith & Wesson, which sold for $15 million, its market cap in 2016 was $1.69 billion.
Good God. Would you encourage people to look at their 401ks and see if they're invested in these gun companies?
Yeah, I think that everybody should. I've seen all sorts of retirement funds that have Ruger and Smith & Wesson and everything wound in. And to be very clear, where I sit, I'm a gun owner. I shoot and hunt with my boys. I still appreciate guns, but this irresponsibleness, this sort of stuff that has blown up, especially since PLACA, since this early 2006, 2007, is just, well, we see what it's doing to the country.
Well, it's interesting because, you talk a lot about your life and growing up in rural. You grew up in Montana too, right?
I grew up in Western Kansas and have lived in Montana for 25 years.
Forgive me, but growing up, you talk about your dad and your brother and everything. And you talked just now about, being a gun owner and everything. And that used to always be I think that was generally the case for years in this country. People in rural areas, had guns and they hunted and they shot targets and had fun, whatever. But you really do a great job writing in the book about how the culture changed. And in this chapter, you do a great job of looking at starting, post 9/11. And I just think that's so important because the gun manufacturing business, which you were a part of, just had to make more and more money. And so they came up with, led by the NRA, but many others, a campaign to scare people to think that they needed guns, to think that they were at war. And they have never stopped doing that. That's what changed and created the new type of gun owner, which, by the way, so many of those guns end up landing in some teenager's hands who blows his head off. And it's just, there's just such a horrible, horrible ripple effect. But talk to me about some of the things you write about it, how specifically the war in Iraq. I never read anybody writing about that, but you did so well. What did the war in Iraq, let me really fast forward, connect to gun sales and the types of guns and who wanted them and who was selling them, by the way? Because a lot of the guys that came home, It's a complex societal thing, but if you think about it, first off, I mentioned George Bush was signing PLACA, but George Bush also launched 2 wars, the Afghanistan and the Iraq War. And essentially what that did is ensure that for all intents and purposes, 20 years, you saw men on TV, cable news, whatever,
decked out in the sort of body armor, AR-15s, battle pistols, everything else. And also, these became, to a large degree, our national heroes. And the NRA and the firearms industry latched onto this from a societal standpoint right off the bat. So when you have Medal of Honor winners and wounded vets, all of these people who I have deep respect for, but the NRA and firearms industry, in my opinion, really egregiously used them for marketing and this sort of faux patriotism. So they would march them through trade shows. They would have them do invocations on stages. They would elevate them further. And then you saw the guns that these people used, which had in war, right, had previously been sort of for war, for police. But your heroes now that you see on CNN for 20 years have these rifles, have these pistols, and then you wrap the flag around this. And so now, fast forward to now, and what do we see? People acting like the heroes that they have seen on TV for 20 years that the NRA and everybody else has elevated. And it became this sort of, you're patriotic if you like these men, like these guns, worship them, and you're not patriotic if you don't do it. So the co-opting of the flag that we have all seen through the last, especially 5, 6, 7, 8 years, this sort of authoritarian machismo. I don't quite know how it's a really toxic social, sort of soup that we've all experienced.
Yes,
mixed in guns. It all has its roots in the firearms industry, the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and then the way the industry and the NRA propagated this at first for votes, right? The NRA figured out, wait, stir this shit up because it makes people vote. You're patriotic if you're us, you're unpatriotic if you're not them. And then you mix in social angst. We're strong men who have guns, so when COVID comes and we have to take over our grocery store, we can do it. You can't. You're weak, right? And so it just keeps going and growing and growing and growing. And here we are now where the right, generally, they're the patriotic, gun-owning, flag-waving, military-loving, bulletproof vest-wearing guys, right? That's how we got here.
I hate it so much. I hate the narrative they created. It's all false. You said when talking about veterans, you always put in the caveat, who I have utmost respect for. Yep. I used to do a segment here. I don't know if you remember, but it's called Stand Up with a Veteran, where I'd interview a veteran every week for at least a year. I think we did it. But here's my thing. People signed up for the military after 9/11 or before, and they never should have been sent to those wars. They never should have become heroes, and we shouldn't have made them heroes when many of them weren't necessarily, or were, most of these guys, to a fault, by the way, when you ask them what they were fighting for in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would say each other. The guy next to me, just to protect the guy next to me who I know and whose family I know, etc. So it's like, it's such a bullshit thing that happened, those wars, and all that it created, which you say here, obviously turned into massive gun sales. So I just had to take a moment to make that point, because those wars should have never happened. Those veterans never should have been made. And what it all led to in terms of everybody wanting one of those guns and celebrating them. And by the way, patriotism should never be about the wars we fought, or make an argument that it should be. But the greatest thing about America is its diversity. And that's what is dividing us. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee, he was basically, you could say, celebrating diversity, protecting black people, and injustice. But the patriots that we've gotten to know, Ryan, of course, or that the word has been hijacked and redefined as only, first responders, people who served in the military, which leads into that toxic soup. I am so sorry for ranting.
Well, you're exactly right. And I have lots of friends who are veterans, and my best friends who are very thoughtful, and they have made the exact point that you just did.
Okay.
Like we're fighting for ourselves.
Yeah.
We're not, these are not heroic things. We're thrown into this and we do what we have to do.
Doing night raids and searching a family's dresser in Fallujah. That's not, I've read so many stories of veterans saying how that's the moral injury. Sorry.
Yeah. So the title of the chapter that we talked about is called Couch Commando. So to get back to where we started, the industry figured out, wait, so there are lots of people that served, right? And legitimately so. And some of them are heroes, and we should thank all of them. But there's a whole new universe of people, like this kid in Buffalo. Dude, he was 18. How could he possibly have served anywhere? He's not old enough to have served.
Yeah.
And so the industry figured out, wait, we'll create a business segment there of people who wanted to serve, who acted like they serve, who sat around on their couch and play games like they are serving, who they can wear their military gear and have their AR-15 at home, and they called them couch commandos. So this is a whole business segment of people who are copycatting the heroes. And then I'm sorry, but you can't throw all the dynamite and matches into a system and think that eventually it ain't going to explode.
Well, yeah, well said.
And that's what we have here. We've been throwing dynamite and matches into systems. I mean, when I started the early part of the industry, we sold 3 to 7 million guns a year. That sounds like a lot. It's 3 to 5, 600,000 a month. During the pandemic, the worst tumultuous time that any of us have remember, George Floyd riots, counter riots, Donald Trump throwing fuel on it all, 25 million guns a year, 614% increase. Okay. So if you're in that business and you want to sell more guns, and social angst and hatred and racism and faux patriotism and everything else sells guns, well, you want more of that, not less. Right. So that's why Donald Trump is like a dream come true.
You write the Bush era, again, before we get to Trump. I mean, I guess you end this chapter on Obama in terms of the timeline. But you write the Bush era cultural shift meant that the components for this sales explosion were in place. Now all we needed for final detonation was a pinch of Sharia law conspiracy theory and a black president with a Muslim sounding name. So well said about putting a point on that era before we get to Trump. But it led to it. It's all connected, obviously.
Yeah. So when I'm driving to the speaking engagement this weekend, and across my phone and on the news, on the radio, starts flashing the details of this shooter. Yeah. Obviously racially motivated, carrying an AR-15, which, by the way, the exact same model as used in Sandy Hook, the exact same model. And that gun was advertised as the get your man card back AR-15. A Bushmaster XM-15 was advertised by Remington, who owned Bushmaster, as buy this gun and you get your man card back. So they would actually send you a man card, right? Buy the gun, now you have your man card. Before that, apparently you didn't have your man card. Like, that's how an 18-year-old kid gets his man card. This is the sort of marketing that PLACA led to, right? Like, you can tell young kids that the way to get their man card is this AR-15. But as I'm driving to this speaking engagement and I hear racially motivated, like Tucker Carlson-esque rant in his manifesto, I'm thinking back to my life through the time at the NRA shows. And I remembered in 2012, I write about in the book, but this is just a single example. I saw a guy selling T-shirts at the NRA convention. And the T-shirt said, it had a picture of a big lion and then a picture of President Obama. And it said, African lion, lion African. And the guy was getting high fives, says he was selling the hell out of these T-shirts, and people were just loving him. And this is the sort of casual, like, not white hood kind of racism, but the same kind of racism that Donald Trump espoused, the same thing that now Tucker Carlson's much more forward with it. But it was leaking through the firearms industry back then, and people were totally okay with it. And people would say, well, we're not racist. We're just like, President Obama's not a citizen. I'm like, excuse me, that's racist. And I saw it bubbling up then. And so now when I see this kid in Buffalo, I'm like, I'm not shocked at that. Yeah. People say that we live in a broken system. I'm like, no, we don't. We live in a system that's working exactly the way it's designed to work.
Oh, well said. Hear, hear. Do you think, I know I've asked you this before, what do you advocate for, Ryan, to bring down mass violence? And do you think, I think, as far as, I've interviewed so many experts about this, the leaders of all the major anti-gun violence organizations and so on. And I think each type of gun violence, suicide, homicide, mass shootings, really deserves a different conversation in terms of what might change the paradigm there. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a catch-all policy law or something. And, given today's political divide, I realize that this isn't going to happen in the U.S. Congress, but it certainly can in a lot of blue states. Let's be honest, probably no red states. They can have state laws. So, here's we wrap up. What do you remind us? What, if anything, you think would change, bring down gun violence in America? A law, a policy, because we can always talk about cultural shifts, but that's certainly not something that we can do very quickly.
So a couple of things. I think I like the way you put this. I'm kind of tired of hearing people say, we're going to solve gun violence. We're going to, no, you're not. We live in a democracy. Democracy happens in the gray areas.
Yeah.
There's the black and the white. Bad stuff happens in the black and the white. The good stuff happens in the gray area. So we're going to institute policies that make things better. We're not going to solve it. We never are going to solve it. There's always going to be gun violence in the United States. We have to do things that make it better instead of make it worse. And I get so frustrated because the talking points from the right often say, well, if you did this, it wouldn't have solved that. We're trying to make it a little bit better. We're not going to fix everything. And we as progressives should stop setting false expectations by telling people we're going to solve it. We're not. We're going to make it better. So to that point, background checks, absolute no-brainer. Red flag laws, we need stronger red flag laws. This guy, this probably had 100 different kinds of red flags. We're hearing now that he was interviewed, about some threats he made during his school years. The last thing I'll say is I'm very worried about the democracy itself and this propensity for open carry armed intimidation that we see across the country, the Michigan Capitol, the Kentucky Capitol. And in the face, my book opens with my son being intimidated at a Black Lives Matter rally by an armed, Second Amendment patriot.
That's right.
Democracy cannot happen at the barrel of a gun. You put a gun to your head, I don't think it's going to feel very democratic, right? So I think that we have to do something across the country to outlaw open carry armed intimidation. I don't think anything is going to be fixed with a stressed out, broken democracy, right? So everything that we care about is held hostage to this all or nothing politics of the NRA. Everything, local school boards, everything.
Yep.
And we have to, at the source of this, we have to start rolling back. I think that's why I think the gun issue is the penultimate issue for our country, because when we can figure out and come together enough to start improving that, I think you'll see everything else start to improve too.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's end on a light note or joke, if you will.
Yes.
You texted me. You mentioned this guy. You said the NRA show during the Obama administration. There was this guy selling these shirts and getting high fives. Who could have seen Buffalo coming? And you sent me a picture of the man and the T-shirt, and it says African lion, and there's a lion, a picture of a lion, and lying African, and a picture of Barack Obama. It's horrible, and he looks like the dad from the Family Guy, by the way.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. How is it that these scripts write themselves like that? Like if you're going to cast the character, that's the guy you would cast, right? So
here's the more lighthearted note I'm getting to. That's a horrific picture, and I'm going to ask you to put that in an email next time, because I was having a decent day until I got that text, and I was like, it didn't ruin my day. I was having a decent moment, and I looked at that text, and I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. I want that in an email. It was too shocking. It was too upsetting. It was like, oh my God, this picture. But
any of the bad stuff, I'll put trigger warnings on for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just put trigger warning on the text, and then you can still text it. But that brings up another question. When one of these horrible shootings happen, a mass shooting is off. The worst shooting is if kids are targeted, obviously Sandy Hook. I guess that's the worst. Second worst is if people are targeted based on, their skin color, ethnicity, et cetera, and so on, in these kind of mass shootings where a lot of people die. And then if I want to continue this stupid exercise of ranking gun violence, I can. But my question is, what happens to your phone when one of these things happen? Who are the types of people you hear from? Do you hear from your old buddies in the business? Do you hear from a lot of media wants to now, especially since you've come out, written this book, been on the Daily Show, you're a big star now. What happens to your phone when one of these shootings happens? Who do you hear from?
So I think it's interesting. I do get the media calls and I get this stuff. Yes. But very interestingly, Pete, and I tell the story early on in my career, when bad stuff happened, the media the firearms industry really freaked out. People would start to call each other, like especially Sandy Hook, Columbine, go back Virginia Tech. You can think back through all these horrible events that hit the news and sort of blew up. And everybody would come together, freak out, and they would freak out because of like, holy shit, now there's going to be gun laws, right? Now there's going to be, we're going to see legislation and sales. Literally the next, you could almost watch it in the hours, would just start to skyrocket. So these mass shootings created big upticks in gun sales because the NRA would freak people out. Like, see, they're coming for your guns. They're going to outlaw everything. And I note in the book that I noticed that stopped when in Las Vegas, 500 people were shot, almost 50 killed. And that was on a Sunday at a concert, at an outdoor concert. And the next Monday, nothing. Nobody talked about it. There weren't talks of legislation. Gun sales didn't skyrocket. In other words, the country has got to this point where it's just like, And so I don't get calls. Firearms industry doesn't talk about this anymore. Why? Nobody believes that these things are going to force any kind of change.
Well, I still have to. I don't know why. I think it's stupid, but I have to believe it. I have to. I have to see a better country, society, somehow. But it's increasingly difficult, obviously. But you're one of the people who is out there that whether or not you're successful, the fact is that you are a great guy who is trying to illuminate the truth and educate people so they can understand. I think one of the hardest things is understanding why we are who we are, this country, our society, the gun laws. And you do a really good job of explaining that. And I think it helps people. Whether or not things change, it helps to know where it comes from. So in the future, I think we can defend against it. You're also a great husband and father. I know that. And you become a good friend to me. And I'm really glad that you were able to join me today and we never shy from talking about this. Keep up the good work. And thank you so much, Ryan.
The last thing I want to say before we leave is I went through quite a, I detail in the book my own personal change. And I used to drive to work every day, and I would drive slower and sometimes drive around blocks just because I was listening to your show on Sirius, Pete. And I just want to say again that the tremendous, unbelievable thoughtfulness and intelligence of your approach and your show has really had a big impact on me. So thanks.
Well, your book has had a big impact on me, and I'm sure a lot of listeners as well. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot to me, and I really, really appreciate it. All right, but I'll let you go. But thank you.
All right, brother.
All right, there he goes, Ryan Bussey. Thank you very much for joining me, Ryan. Always great. I hope you'll follow him on Twitter, get his book, watch his TED Talk, and I look forward to having him back. Such a great guy. And I'm also going to, at some point, visit his family out there in beautiful Montana. I can't wait to get out there. If anybody else is listening to Montana, reach out to me. I don't know. I can't think of any other Montana listeners. standupwithpete@gmail.com. There's only 4 people in the state, so prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. All right, now joining me is one of my favorite people to talk to learn from. I've read all of his books, his articles. I stay up to date on his Twitter timeline, which is always epic and powerful and fierce and brilliant and often hilarious. He is the anti-racist speaker and author of so many books. He's won awards. He's spoken at organizations, different countries and companies for years. And he's just awesome. He is Tim Wise, ladies and gentlemen, on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise. Read his Medium articles at timjwise.medium.com. Subscribe there, as well as patreon.com/speak out with Tim Wise. His latest book is Dispatches from the Race War, a bracing call to action in a moment of social unrest is what Publishers Weekly says about that book. And it's so good. And he is so good. And today's conversation is really good. Here we go with Tim Wise right now. I am recording Tim Wise, who I am very excited to that you could fit me in between your appearances on 2 other cable networks and hopefully a million other shows. Thank you, as always, for joining me.
Oh, you bet. Thank you.
You're in high demand in these times for a lot of different reasons, but I'm guessing you got a lot of phone calls when a white man targeted black people and slaughtered 10 of them in one of the worst massacres in American history.
Yeah, I think the thing about doing this work is all of us who do anti-racism work, that's when we get the call, right, is when something horrible, awful, tragic happens, whether it's the killing of George Floyd, right, or whether it's a mass murder like this one. The same thing happened after Dylan Roof. Same thing happened after Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh. Same thing happened after the killing in New Zealand. Same thing happened after El Paso, right? It's always that. And the fact that these things keep happening often enough to keep those of us who do this work in the work ought to tell us, that we've got a pretty serious sickness on our hands, and it just keeps vomiting itself up every few weeks or months.
Well, I want to get to that. I want to get to a couple of other things, race-related for sure, and even if time, talk about just the media's coverage of it, of course. And you've got 3 amazing threads. I don't know how you do it. Well, actually, I do. You're a very smart guy. But first, I did want to get your take. I haven't talked to you, and you have written a post at Medium since the decision leaked, the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade leaked. Am I saying it right? And I wanted to get just your overall take, a little bit about what you wrote in this piece, that everybody can read it at Medium.
We can take them in real brief order. I mean, the one about the reversal and what it's really about. Yeah, the point that I was trying to make there, if you read the decision, and it's just a horrific decision, lots of legal scholars, and I'm not one, but lots of legal scholars have weighed in on the absurdity of it from a jurisprudential perspective. But the fact that Alito in the decision has to draw upon the wisdom of a guy like Sir Matthew Hale, who was a 17th century English judge.
Yeah.
Just as an interesting side note, there are two Matthew Hales of whom I know. This is one. The other one is a neo-Nazi who's serving life in prison for trying to kill a federal judge, one of the leading white supremacist neo-Nazis in the last 20 or 30 years. So this name, clearly, if your last name is Hale, for the love of God, do not name your kid Matt, because it's not going to turn out well. But Alito harkens back to this guy, Matthew Hale, for his argument that he makes that, abortion is awful. And we know this because listen to Matthew Hale, who said it was a great crime. Matthew Hale's also somebody who sentenced women to death for witchcraft. And he was the initial sort of author of the theory that husbands could not by law be guilty of raping their wives, because once a couple was married, the woman had essentially given her body to her husband forever, and he could do with it whatever he wanted. If that's the authority that you're hearkening back to, you're giving away the game, that this really isn't about saving the babies. It's not about the fetus. It's about controlling women, which is what many of us have been trying to tell you for a long time, that that's really what this is. It is about controlling women's reproductive autonomy, controlling women's bodies, reestablishing traditional patriarchal hierarchy. That's all it was ever about. It was never about states' rights. It was never even really about abortion. It was about the desire to control women. And when you read the decision, that becomes pretty obvious.
I had no idea. I just talked to a constitutional law scholar who joins me regularly, Eric Siegel, and he did a deep dive into the decision. He made references to all these people, but nothing specifically. So I'm glad that you just shared that with me. I did not know that. And a good warning to the Hale families.
Yes. Just anything but Matthew, clearly. Yeah. And then the second piece that I wrote was this piece on fetal life having value, but not equal to the woman. I wanted to write this one because I do think it's important to sort of debunk this notion that I think a lot of anti-abortion folks have, which is that those of us who believe in women's autonomy just don't have any at all compassion or concern about fetal life. Look, we're the ones who are trying to get prenatal care for everybody. We clearly care about it. We're the ones who are trying to make sure. We love unborn children so much that we want women who want to have a child to be able to get the nutrition and the health care and the assistance that they need to have that child, have the child be healthy, and then raise that kid to 18 and get it out of the house. Like, that's what we want. Right? It's the other side that does. So we don't need to be lectured about the value of fetal life. We do care about it. But the difference is still important to understand. The difference between potentiality of personhood. There's no question the fetus is human and that it's living. So it's human life. But personhood is not a biological concept. Personhood is not a scientific category. Personhood is a philosophical concept, and it's one that humans have disagreed about for a long time. Our great religious traditions disagree about when personhood begins. And even within Christianity and Judaism and Islam, there are disagreements. So personhood has always been a more complicated thing. And what those of us who believe in Roe and really beyond Roe, who believe in securing women's reproductive autonomy, believe is that however valuable that fetal life is, and however valuable that woman knows it is, whether they, any woman who does terminate a pregnancy it's not like they sit around like some folks I think believe, and they're like, well, I was going to have a baby, but then my girlfriend's called and they really want to go to Florida for the weekend. Right. So I think I'm just going to go terminate the kid. Like, nobody does that.
No one changes their mind like that when they're that far. Like, it's
nobody does that. No one says to themselves, God, I was thinking I wanted a kid, but really what I want is this rum and coke. Like, no one does that. Right. But there's this impression that we have rooted in misogyny, rooted in this belief that women are witches who just want to kill their babies, who just are evil and satanic and have to be controlled by men, rooted in this ancient religiosity and the thinking of people like Sir Matthew Hale, right? That they have to be controlled. And what I was trying to say in that piece was, yeah, fetal life has value, but the life of the woman has to be considered primary to that. And there are a couple of sort of reasons why that is. And I go through them in the piece, and I'm looking at it now to just sort of remind myself of what it is that I said, because my brain doesn't work as well as I thought. But what I said was, that when a woman does choose to carry a baby to term and to become a mother, they obviously are exercising this awe-inspiring choice. And as someone who's a father of 2 daughters and was part of that process and from beginning to end and have been part of that process, I know how awe-inspiring it is. But to say that it is awe-inspiring when a woman decides, you know what, I'm going to sacrifice my body for these 40 weeks in order to bring another life into the world, there's a difference between voluntarily sacrificing yourself for that purpose and being required by the state to do so. Right. To demand that of a woman, to say that you must do that as a matter of law is an abomination, because it turns women into involuntary servants on behalf of fetal life at the order of the state. And it would subject them to suspicion and investigation, maybe even prosecution, not just for having an abortion, but if they have a miscarriage that seems like, oh, that might be suspicious. Did you drink? Did you smoke? Did you take drugs? Did you exercise too much or not enough? Did you exert yourself too much? There are all of these things that become possible once you ascribe personhood to the fetus. It's not about saying the fetus is just a clump of cells. We can say it's more than that, but that doesn't constitute a reason morally or ethically to then extend the notion of personhood to that entity. And in fact, to suggest that a woman should be forced to carry that child to term on orders of the state actually cheapens motherhood, right? It actually is essentially saying this is a predetermined path. It's been established by someone else. You're not making this choice. This isn't actually what you want at all. It cheapens the miracle of childbirth. It cheapens the meaning of that. It basically turns it into forced obligation. Right. It basically says that children are things that happen to us, not these things that we want to bring into our lives. And so we have to have a deeper understanding of what the difference is between potential life, potential personhood and actual personhood, because the only way that you can say they're the same, the only way that you can actually say that they're the same is if you were to rely on a religious conception of the value of fetal life. And you're entitled to your religious conception, by the way. Right. But you're not entitled in a secular society to make law based on your religious, entirely theological premise. Right. And that's the other problem that I think has been ignored a lot in this discussion.
OK, so well said. But let me move on to, I think there's a connection here. Maybe you can make it if anybody can. But you talk about abortion and you talk about poor folks, or you talk about specifically black and brown folks who a lot of white folks don't like and they don't want in this country, but they are going to force them to have babies. And then you can talk about immigration and economics to get to replacement theory, which, of course, is at the heart of the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto. And unfortunately, it's been at the heart of some of the most watched programs on television in the world, on shows like Fox News, not to mention YouTube, and not to mention there are those views held and spouted by actual Republican Congress people at this point, including Matt Gaetz. Right. So, Tim, hopefully that segue, there's something there. But I also would just love to get your perspective. You've written about this and kind of historical understanding of the great replacement theory.
Right. Well, I mean, replacement theory, starts off in sort of the swamps of the far right internet. Actually, it goes back even further to that. There were segregationist senators like Bilbo in Mississippi back in the 40s that were using this kind of terminology. It doesn't really take off, though, until the book Camp of the Saints, which is one of Steve Bannon's favorite books, which is a sort of futuristic fantasy novel, sort of dystopian fantasy about the hordes of Africa and the Middle East, swarming into white Europe and overwhelming it. And then in more recent times, there have been other theorists, including a guy in France who in 2012 actually coined this phraseology of the Great Replacement, which is, again, the same idea that these non-white and non-Christian folks are coming into these white and Christian places. They were thinking more in terms of Europe, but it's now sort of been exported to the way that a lot of white nationalists in the U.S. think about immigration, for instance, or think about demographic and cultural change, or think about birth rate differences. And it has been thoroughly mainstreamed. This is the kind of stuff. This is what's so deep about this. This is the kind of stuff that David Duke used to talk about when he was still in the Klan, and when he founded the National Association for the Advancement of White People, which was what he founded right after he left the Klan, but before he ran for office. So in the early to mid 80s, David Duke is saying all this kind of stuff. He's talking about, he didn't use the term great replacement because that phrase wasn't there, but that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the substitution of brown-skinned immigrants and black folks also for the founding stock of the country was the kind of terminology that he would use. And that stuff was so toxic, even when he ran for office in 90 and 91, that he didn't campaign on that. He didn't talk about that openly. We had to dig that stuff out. We had to actually find where he had said that, because all he was doing, I say all because, this should be enough, but by comparison to now, it's pretty weak tea. All he was doing was using like your typical racial dog whistles, right? So he talked about welfare. He talked about affirmative action. He talked about crime, and everybody knew what he was doing, but he never went anywhere near this. They're trying to replace you with brown people stuff. So not only I sometimes think David Duke became the symbolic head of the Republican Party, and I think that's true, but it's not David Duke circa 1990 and 91 when he ran for Senate and governor. It's actually David Duke circa 1978 when he was still burning crosses. Right. That's the David Duke that's because the rhetoric that was third rail, even when he ran for office, which was bad enough, is now entirely mainstream. The New York Times deep dive on Tucker found, he has referred to the Great Replacement or given voice to that thinking, the idea that the Democratic Party, the liberals, the globalists, whatever, are intentionally seeking to replace what Carlson calls the, legacy Americans. I think we all know what he means by that.
Man.
With these newcomers. And he's done it on 400 different shows, 400 different times that he has either directly or indirectly talked about that kind of thing. And I want us to understand the difference between great replacement theory and just regular conservative thinking, let's say, on immigration, because it's not the same thing. There's been a long history of people disagreeing over immigration policy, and a lot of that's been overtly racist for sure. A lot of it has just been about like, well, what's the best thing economically, right? Like, is it going to cost more in various services than the economic, development benefits? And there are people on both sides of the political aisle who disagree about that and go back and forth. People will remember Reagan, signed into law immigration reform in 86. That actually expanded the amount of immigration that took place. So it didn't used to be, anywhere near this divisive an issue. You had pro-immigration folks in the Republican Party. You had some anti-immigration folks in the Democratic Party. But this is different. And the reason it's not just different, it's uniquely dangerous. And it is uniquely given to violence because of two things that separate it from regular conservative thinking about immigration. Number one, it is conspiratorial in nature, right? The idea isn't just, these silly liberals, they don't understand how much immigration costs us as a country and the net benefits are outweighed by the net, economic harm. No, it's these liberals / Jews / globalists / whatever are deliberately trying to genocide you. They are trying to take your country, to hurt you, to cause you pain. These are phrases that Tucker Carlson has directly used and that you'll see all over 4chan and all over the fever swamps of the right-wing internet. The second thing that distinguishes it is predicated on the notion of an existential threat. Yeah. So it isn't just like these folks are coming in and it might drive down the wage base for you if you're a lower income worker, and that might be a problem that we need to talk about. It's no. They're coming in and they are going to eliminate you. You are going to disappear from the country. Everything is going to be lost. When you phrase it as an existential threat that is being brought to you by a conspiratorial evil force, all bets are off. You can no longer have a rational policy discussion because the people you're fighting, you view them as evil. You view them as the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain pulling the strings. They have to be destroyed. And this is exactly precisely what Hitler said about the Jews in 1930s Germany. Said the exact same stuff. They're trying to destroy the Aryan stock. They are trying to infiltrate and take over the economy. They are an existential threat to this group. Not just that we have disagreements with them, not just that their religion is different and weird and they're sort of, clannish and stick to themselves and we don't like how they dress or Yiddish or what. No, it wasn't that. It was they are an existential threat. That's what he says in Mein Kampf. He talks about Jews as a biological pollutant and a cultural pollutant in the body politic of Germany that is going to replace the Germanic Aryan racial stock. So when you go down this road, you can't be surprised when mass violence occurs. It is entirely predictable. It wouldn't have been predictable if we were just having debates about immigration policy.
It's such an accurate point. The same could be said for abortion clinics that have been targeted. The same could be said for what happened in New Zealand, the Christ Church shooting. I mean, you can look to other countries. Right. It is ginned up by media, and in this case now, politicians on the right, for sure. I think it's definitely a lot more on the right. Follow whatever is being said on the right because they simplify it, they boil it down so you can understand it, and it scares the shit out of people. Maybe try to connect this 18-year-old kid from the area where my mom grew up, which is white, poor, and rural, knowing that black people live in this area of Buffalo, so he had to travel that far to see some and kill them. Like, explain how it gets, what happens to any person who gets radicalized by an ideology. We used to talk about Al-Qaeda, and they'd have to watch a fucking VHS tape that, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or bin Laden made and pop it in or go to the deep ends of the internet. But now it's mainstream, most popular, most watched shows. What does that do?
Right. Well, I mean, it just makes it so much easier. This young man, this terrorist in Buffalo, probably, he says he got it from 4chan and he was just tooling around being bored when COVID hit. So he may or may not have ever watched Tucker. And I'm sure that'll be Tucker's defense, right? Who knows if this guy even watched me? I'm sure
he's not the only one. Well, whatever. Yeah. OK, fair enough.
Maybe not. But 2 points are worth making. If this theory of white replacement had been left in those fever swamps of 4chan and Reddit threads and all of these places, Daily Stormer and all of these, neo-Nazi type spaces on the internet, it wouldn't have nearly the cachet that it has right now with certain people. It is the loop that is created when those folks say it and then it gets amplified in the mainstream. Even if I don't hear the mainstream guy say it, the people in the fever swamp heard the mainstream guy. And so they push it even more. They're very aware of what Tucker Carlson is saying. They brag about how their ideas have gone mainstream. The Daily Stormer folks, Andrew Anglin and those guys talk about what a great ally Tucker Carlson is to their cause. So the Tucker Carlsons of the world, the Laura Ingrams of the world, give essentially extra, what am I trying to say? Fuel the flames that are being started over here, maybe on 4chan. But once those incel trolls that are sitting around eating Hot Pockets, playing video games all day, hear that some mainstream dude that makes millions of dollars and has all these followers is echoing what they're saying, they're never going to move off of that, man. At that point, their thing is, let's say it more. Let's, because we're influencers now. We're important now, right? And so then, because they keep saying it, because they double down and they triple down and they quadruple down, then that kid walks into 4chan because he's quote unquote bored, if we accept his story, and he sees it. Whereas if that stuff had been nipped in the bud back after Charlottesville, and everybody on the right from Trump on down says, I don't know what y'all are thinking, but this isn't what we meant when we said make America great. This is horrible. This is awful. We're not with this at all. If they had been roundly criticized and condemned, I guarantee you it wouldn't have gone away. Right. But it wouldn't have it wouldn't be punching above its weight the way it is right now. That is because it has been given succor and support by the Tucker Carlsons.
What about the comparisons? You have a tweet thread that starts with comparing the white terrorist in Buffalo to the black guy who ran over people at a parade in Waukesha, that in Wisconsin, or the black guy who shot up the New York City subway is absurd. Nothing suggests the Wisconsin parade was targeted for racial reasons or the subway victims. And then you unpack that. It depends on where you heard it from, but you unpack that. But why is it just generally not right to make such comparisons when black people, even if they did target white people because they were white?
Right. Well, there are two broad sort of whataboutisms that the right started doing online yesterday after Buffalo happened.
Yeah, let's take them.
One was that one, right, which was, well, where were y'all? And this is trending right now, 92,000 tweets last time I saw. Why were y'all when the Waukesha killer drove through that parade? And where were y'all when the subway shooter shot up the subway? Where, well, first of all, those did get media attention. They weren't ignored. The subway thing in particular, because it happened in the biggest media market in the world. But as I said, aside from just the sickness of always turning to that before you even condemn what just happened, which is in and of itself problematic, they're not comparable. There is nothing to suggest that either of those actions, Waukesha or the New York subway, were motivated by any kind of racial animus or hatred. Did the dude in Waukesha have some stuff on his Facebook page that suggested he didn't like cops very much and maybe wasn't real fond of white people? Yeah. But two things are important. Number one, most black folks aren't real fond of cops. So that, and yet that's not motivating them to just go kill cops. There are like 26 cops a year, I think, the latest numbers that I saw that are killed by black people. So this is not a big trend. A lot more black folks don't like cops than kill cops. So that's got nothing to do with it. Secondly, the law enforcement folks in Waukesha haven't suggested that he drove his vehicle through that crowd because he's like, oh, I see some little old white ladies in a band. I see a white guy with a trombone. I got to go get him. Like, there's nothing to indicate that. The reports that were out were saying that he was driving and he was trying to get away from someone possibly that was chasing him. I don't know. But there's no evidence of racial animus. As for the guy in New York, I watched like 20 of his videos. I actually spent hours one night doing that. He spent most of his time rambling about other black people, going off on other black people. And then the people he shot in the subway, he didn't target white people. He shot at least one or two of the people he shot were black. I think there were some Latinos shot, Asian, white. I think he shot just at anybody and everyone. There was no indication of racial animus. So it's just not the same. Another reason it's not the same, there's no one in Congress or on mainstream media pushing a theory that caused either of those two men to do what they did. And if there were, they'd be out of a job or expelled from the House of Representatives for doing so. So that's another difference. The second whataboutism was maybe even more troubling. It hasn't gotten as much attention, but it's more troubling, and it's going to be coming if it's not already, is this idea that, well, if you're going to blame Tucker and Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz and all these people for these incidents, and you have to blame Democrats and liberals and progressives for whatever riots or violence happened in the summer of 2020 after George Floyd, because after all, when you talk about systemic racism, that's going to set people off too, right? So why aren't you to blame for that? Big, huge difference there. Number one, black folks don't need to read about systemic racism online to know that it's a thing.
Just to be clear, there's so many illustrations of that. I just got to interrupt you only because I just saw this video of this black homeowners being harassed in the most horrific of ways.
I just watched it. No, I know. I just watched it.
And the point is, what I tweeted around it was, black people do not need to watch this video. Black homeowners don't need to watch this video, but white people all need to watch this video to illustrate the point you're making, that everyday racism is not something that, or sexism is not something that the targets of it need to read about or watch.
Right. Black people don't have to go on a Reddit thread or a blog and have somebody like me use the term systemic racism. And they're like, what? There's systemic racism? I'm going to go kill white people now. Like that isn't happening. But white people, this is the difference. Yeah. White people like this guy in Buffalo, he's not experiencing replacement. He's not experiencing genocide. He went and read about it. And that's what set him off, because it doesn't actually comport with his lived experience. It's completely different. The other difference, very important, is that when we talk about systemic racism, the word systemic is really important because it means that the actions we're taking are an attempt to fix the system. I can't shoot bullets at the system. I try to get laws changed. I try to get different people elected. I try to influence the people in positions of power to make those changes. If you have a systemic analysis, it's the opposite of a conspiratorial analysis. It's the opposite of those people are doing this to you. I know there are some white folks who think that's what anti-racism is, that we're talking about these white people are trying to keep you down. That's not what anyone in this movement of any seriousness is saying. We're talking about systems and institutions put in place a long time ago that now have their own internal logic that we have failed to question and failed to challenge. Systemic analysis actually is less likely to cause violence, specifically because you know full well that if you go out and try to take on the system violently, the system's got more guns than you.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do it. So all of these whataboutisms make no sense, but that's what they have, and that's what they'll retreat to. And sadly, my guess is that because we do have a dominant media that does that both sides shit, without thinking critically about what's actually going on, that they might fall into that trap. It's unfortunate.
But it's also, I think, important to point out when you talk about taking on the system, you don't have to worry about that. Like, there is a theory that a lot of violent white supremacists and others, insurrections have, that the cops are with them. And then there's data that the cops are with them, as pointed out. I think this is sometimes a little cheap, but so often, and you shared this, and I think I might have retweeted it. I forget who shared it, but talking about how black people, innocent, unarmed black people, are killed, whereas horrific white shooters are taken into custody peacefully. And the reason I think it's a little cheap is because I've been abused by cops many times. Once because I rode my bike on the grass in Central Park. I've been roughed up, and I'm white. Sometimes I think it's not overplayed, but it's underplayed that there's police abuse against white people, white men, all the time. The point being, some of these violent people think, well, the state will be with me. They'll agree with me.
Right. Well, they at least believe that there's a significant number of law enforcement folks who will not, at the very least, will not shoot them if they commit one of these acts. Right. And they've got evidence to support that. Right. Dylan Roof, they took to Burger King. Right. So in every one of these cases, they've been able to take people alive. Tim McVeigh blows up a building and kills 168 people. When they caught him, they brought him in peacefully, and he was prosecuted, and he was ultimately put to death, right, by the state, which is a whole nother subject. But the idea of law enforcement officials themselves and how they respond, obviously, there is some reason for these terrorists to believe that if they do this, they will get away with this. That doesn't mean that cops don't occasionally brutalize white people, as you said. And what I've long argued is, the very fact that they do that, we ought to ask, why is it that even if you take black people out of the equation for a minute, take brown folk out of the equation, just think about white Americans are more likely to be assaulted or abused or killed by cops on a per capita basis than white people in any other country on earth. Right? Why? Why are we so brutal? Why do we allow cops to be so brutal even toward white people? Well, the reason that happens is because the law enforcement apparatus in this country historically was created to control black and brown and those who were the have-nots. But once you've trained cops to have that siege mentality because you're afraid of, the people on that side of town, don't be surprised when occasionally they take it out on your kid too. Yes. Right? Don't be surprised when occasionally, because, once you get a cop amped up to think that somebody's smarting off to him or being a smart ass or whatever, or doing something not supposed to do, of course, some folks are going to take it out on everybody. But the root of that behavior, even when it's taken out on the hide of a white person, is still the structure, the system, the institutional logic, and all of that came from white supremacy and class supremacy. And that's what that came from. And
I'm guessing, and we've probably talked about this and you've probably written a lot of it is also sexist or gender-based, because I often think about, given my temperament, personality, which is not always healthy, I'm emotionally reactive. If you gave me a badge and a gun and very little oversight, I don't think I would be a great police officer. I think maybe now that I've been a little more enlightened and older or something, but like as a younger man, certainly I think I would have done a lot of things that I can't attribute to racism or even sexism. I can contribute to a certain extent. This is the system that law enforcement just dominates. everything. There's just so little oversight on them. They have so many rights and very little consequences so often, and just the whole thin blue line thing. I think I would have been bad. I think it's so much of the system and the rules and the paradigm it creates with the public than it is the obvious sexism, racism, authoritarianism bullshit.
Absolutely. 100%.
Oh, you didn't have anything profound to add to that?
No, I mean, other than just, look, I think
you don't agree that I'd be a shitty cop?
You would have been, as would I. And it took me, I'm 53 and it's taken me several years of therapy even to learn how to respond constructively to things and positively to things. And your typical cop who goes into policing in his maybe early 20s or late teens in some cases hasn't had a minute of therapy. Doesn't even oftentimes have the college degree giving them insights maybe into the history they need to know and into any of that. No, and so of course, if you talk, I remember what I was like when I was 21 and 22. Yeah. And when people would say shit to me, I'm 5'8", so I'm not gonna get in a fight. Come on.
Same. Yeah.
But I definitely would have been, if you gave me a gun and a badge.
Yes. Right.
And now different. I can brutalize you and get away with it. And now you can't respond violently. Oh, yeah, I would have, because there's a hyper masculinity piece, right? That is part and parcel of policing culture, which is why, and I think we talked about this on one of the shows, there was that clip from a couple months ago where that guy interrupted another cop from his own department, a woman, or maybe it was his own partner, trying to de-escalate a situation, right? Trying to get in between him, the partner, the male partner, and this black guy that was being, shaken down or harassed or whatever. And the guy, the male cop, grabbed his own partner by the throat and pushed her up against the vehicle. That's, again, we can say, well, it's a bad apple, but there's a cultural issue here that ends up, because if you don't play that game culturally, if you don't fit in with that, you will be run out of policing. You are not going to be able to fit in, and folks will make your life hell if you don't go along with that. So even for all of the people who might get into law enforcement for the right reason, you take a good person with good intentions, put them in a broken system. I assure you, the system is going to win.
Exactly.
Not the broken person.
That's what I was trying to say, and that's perfectly succinct. Thank you, as always, Tim, for joining me. I know you got to get off to much more high-profile shows, so I really appreciate you spending all this time with me. As always, we love you, man. Thank you.
Anytime, sir.
All right, there he goes. Tim Wise, ladies and gentlemen. Always great. And thank you to Ryan Bussey as well. Go follow Tim on Twitter, Ryan on Twitter, and your homework is to go thank them on Twitter. Let them know that you heard them here on Stand Up, so they'll always be encouraged to come back, knowing that we've got a great big audience of thoughtful, interesting folks listening to them. I love you guys, and I am very excited to see you on Thursday night. I've developing some really cool new ideas. Been reaching out to some listeners. Going to have a larger conversation for the show. I know I've mentioned that a billion times, and if you're still listening, you probably don't even believe it. But seriously, I'm serious. Some very exciting new developments that I think I'm going to finally be able to implement that have a lot to do with the show, and even more importantly, the community that we've built along with it, which, if you're kind of an active member, whether it be on the Discord platform or hanging out with us Thursday nights or meeting other people on social media through the show in any way, then you'll love it. I think you'll really like some of these ideas that I want to share with you. So meet up with me on Thursday night on Zoom. If you're not already a subscriber, go to standupwithreef.com right now and sign up for as little as $5. You can always pay more, and a lot of you do. A lot of generous folks out there that are subscribing, donating to this work, that see it as something that makes your life better, and certainly does mine. So thank you very much for that, and I will talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up, which hopefully I'll have good news about the Board of Education election, and that our candidates that we worked so hard for won. I've learned so much on this campaign, and it's meant so much to me. It's been really hard for my family for a lot of different reasons I've shared with you, and if you don't know, then reach out to me. I'd be happy to tell you. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Be the change you want to see in the world. Take it away, John Carroll.
Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.